Hey everyone, we're going to continue talking about World War I. Today we're going to talk about how World War I was vastly different from any war that had been fought before it, both in terms of the strategies employed and the technology used that made it the most devastating and horrible war in history up to that time. So by the time we're done, you should be able to identify who the two opposing sides were in World War I. We've talked about the alliance system already if you're in my class, but the sides do change up a little bit. Some people switch from one side to the other, and we'll talk about that. You should be able to describe the plan the Germans had to win the war and why it didn't work initially, and be able to identify all the new technology during the war and its impact on the armies and individual soldiers too. Allied and Central Powers, you should be able to identify by the end of the video. That's the two opposing sides. The Schlieffen Plan, that's the German plan to defeat France and Russia. And also trench warfare and U-boats being strategies and new weapons being implemented during that time. So here are the main countries involved. The Allied powers were known before the war as the Triple Entente. I know that's confusing because Triple Alliance you think would be the Allied powers because they sound the same, but not the case. The Triple Entente becomes the Allies, or the Allied powers. That's Great Britain and France initially. That's the main powers. Belgium ends up getting involved later in 1914. Starting in 1915, Italy joins the war on the Allied side. They switched away from the Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance. Russia was in the war on the Allied side until 1917 when they withdrew because of problems at home, that being the Russian Revolution. And we'll talk more about that during this unit. Starting in 1917, though, about the same time Russia withdrew, the United States entered the war on the Allied side. Also, a lot of colonies involved. All these countries really drew on their overseas possessions for manpower and for resources, such as colonies in Africa. Great Britain enlisted Australia and New Zealand to fight on their side. There's plenty of other examples as well. The Central Powers are the antagonists, if you're looking at it from the Allied point of view. That's Germany and Austria-Hungary from the Triple Alliance. The Ottoman Empire, which is in southeastern Europe, we now know that as Turkey. And starting in 1915, Bulgaria joined on the side of the Central Powers as well. Now, Germany has a major problem. They have enemies on both sides. They've got France to the west and Russia to the east. They're sort of surrounded, and they have to figure out a way around that. And a general with the last name von Schlieffen develops what they thought was a bulletproof plan to deal with this two-front threat. And on paper, it was amazing. They were going to just really quickly overrun France. They were going to go through Belgium because the Germany-France border is really, really thickly wooded, a lot of forest there. They were going to go through Belgium, down into France, overrun them, take over Paris. Then once that was done, they were going to shift all of their resources over to the Eastern Front. They were going to fight Russia. The war was going to be over in 42 days. The Schlieffen Plan, they thought, would only take 6 weeks or 42 days to win the war. Now, as you know, when you develop plans, a lot of times they might look really good in theory, and then once you put them into practice, they don't actually work. Well, that was the case with the Schlieffen Plan. Belgium put up a very stiff resistance. The Germans sort of expected Belgium to be overwhelmed and intimidated by the German army and be like, oh, you're headed to France? Right this way, Germany. And they didn't do that, and that really slowed the Germans down. And as a result, the Germans were very angry and actually committed a lot of atrocities, mass murders, for example, in Belgium, and that angered Great Britain to the point that they finally entered the war on the side of France and Russia. Also, Russia was able to mobilize a lot faster than Germany thought they would. As you might remember from talking about Russia in this class before, the knock on Russia is that they're very slow and very backwards and not very industrial, but they had been mobilizing in preparation for this war for quite some time. So they were ready way earlier than Germany expected. So the Schlieffen Plan, again, looked good on paper, but it sort of fell flat when it came to actually putting it to use. Now, since this took way longer than 6 weeks, you get into winter time, and it's very difficult to fight in the snow. So both sides, France and Germany, sort of bogged down along a line in northeastern France. And there developed a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation in a war where neither side can get the advantage, and they just sort of fight back and forth to a draw. So to try to protect themselves from the other side, because they weren't able to advance very well, both sides dig a trench system from where the soldiers could fight. And it wasn't just like one line on either side. It was a very big network of trenches that led you to, medical bunkers, officer headquarters, all of that. On a later slide, you'll actually see a map of a trench network, and you can see how big it was. And you see some pictures here of what trenches actually looked like. You have people sort of looking over the top of the trench, firing at the other opposing trench. And this came to define the Western Front of World War I. It really never moved very much. There were some major battles in World War I that took months and cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties. And this line where the fighting took place never moved more than a few miles either way. It was just a complete draw. It was a stalemate. Neither side could really advance. But I'll show you here some maps and pictures that'll better illustrate the trench system. On the left there you have where the line of trenches really was. Paris is around where the E in France is there. So the Germans were trying to get towards Paris, but couldn't make it because of the resistance. And really along those lines, that entire line there on the France-German border, you have this trench system that sort of, again, defined the fighting. On the right is an overhead view from a plane of the trenches during the war, and you can see how elaborate they really were. It wasn't just one line facing another line. It was this huge network. And the area in the middle you see there between the two opposing sides is called no man's land, and that was area that was sort of neutral and wasn't controlled by either side. And the objective a lot of times in trench warfare was to try to take over no man's land, defeat the other side in their trench, and then keep trying to advance. But inevitably what would happen, even if you did take the opposing trench, you would probably just eventually lose it back to the other side and you'd be pushed back. And again, there's never really much movement in either direction. But no man's land was often filled up by mines to thwart the other side from trying to attack, or barbed wire was put there. The explosions left by shells from artillery would make it very, very treacherous ground to try to run across, very muddy. It was just very, very, very ugly in terms of war. And this is unlike anything that the people who signed up for the war had expected. People who signed up for World War I in 1914 were envisioning this 18th century style of fighting with this, all the soldiers on horseback and riding off courageously into battle and coming back a hero. And it ends up being absolute Armageddon. It was hell on earth. Here's what the trenches look like today. They didn't really fill them in after the war, so they were grown over in many cases. You see there on the left, that is in northeast France. You can go and see that. Today it's out in, this pastoral farmland, but you see the remnants of a horrible war there on the countryside. And then there's a more fortified, stone-enforced trench on the right, also in northeastern France. Now, World War I is the first war to reflect the industrial era on a large scale. A lot of terrible weapons used. Again, before World War I, a lot of soldiers were still on horseback and still used very old-style muskets or rifles. That all changes with the industrial era and the mechanization of war, you could say. Poison gas was first used by the Germans. It was kind of shot across no man's land in pellets, and once it exploded and wafted into the other trenches, it could cause blindness, choking, seizures, all manner of problems. It was a dangerous weapon to use, though, because if the wind shifted, it just came right back at you, which also happened in a lot of cases. And it led to gas masks becoming very standard on both sides. You see a picture there of soldiers and dogs being given gas masks to protect themselves. The most common of all the poison gases is mustard gas. It was made from distilled mustard seeds, I guess, and led to horrible lesions on the skin, but also internally on the lungs, and essentially would just choke the person to death. It was horrible. A lot of new artillery, long-range guns that could fire for miles and miles and miles, and you see just how huge they were compared to the people standing near them. Much more accurate and, again, much more range than the cannons that had been used in previous wars. Some other new technology used. Airplanes are often glorified During World War One, you think of the flying aces, for example, Snoopy on his doghouse, right, as the Red Bear, fighting the Red Baron and all that. Airplanes were mostly actually used for surveillance. You would fly over the other side's trenches and see where their positions and their artillery were and all of that. There were some dogfights where the two sides would kind of duke it out in the air using guns on the planes, but that didn't really have a huge impact on the war. Actually, the use of airplanes in World War One as an actual fighting tool, very overrated. Again, it was mostly used for surveillance. Tanks made their debut during World War One, invented by the British to help clear no man's land. That the tanks were able to, plow through the barbed wire and the mines and all that and make a space for the soldiers to come through. Machine guns were more commonly used during World War One. I mean, there are examples of machine guns being used as far back as the Civil War in the United States, but they weren't as reliable or as heavy duty or as rapid firing as they were during World War One. This made trench warfare incredibly deadly. You could use two machine guns on either side of a particular area of the trench and just fire them across each other like an X, and you could mow down an entire army that was coming towards you. So very, very deadly. The Germans heavily instituted submarines known as U-boats, U being Untersee, like under the water, undersea. But U-boats were very, very useful for the Germans in terms of disrupting British shipping of supplies or soldiers. U-boats are also a big reason that America ended up getting involved in World War One, because in many cases U-boats torpedoed passenger ships that were carrying supplies, but they were also carrying citizens, in many cases Americans. Most notably, the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. The Lusitania was a British ship, but 128 Americans were aboard that died in that, and it angered the Americans a great deal, and eventually, like I said, will lead to America entering the war in April of 1917. That'll do it for today. As always, ask your teacher if you have any questions, and be sure to reference this video in preparation for your unit test. Cheers!